I suppose, music researcher and teacher.
Yeah. Is that how you've always seen yourself?
No, I decided to do to follow a musical route when I was about 13 or 14.
Hmm.
Before that, I'd been really interested in maths and science, and
Oh, so what tipped you into the music direction?
yeah, actually, it was. I think my mother recognised that there may be something musical in me because I started trying to compose music when I was still quite little, when I was 7 or 8 years old,
Oh,
and I couldn't write it down. So my older sister, who was learning the recorder, I think, sort of was able to write some of the notes. And then when, I didn't actually start the piano till I was 10. My mum, and we didn't have much money, so actually having private lessons was a big sacrifice. I remember
yes.
taking money sort of wrapped up in a handkerchief, for the lessons. It was a big thing.
Wow.
Um, and then when I went to secondary school, because I'd already started the piano, all those that had started an instrument were lined up and just handed out. So Ockleford, 2 steps forward, and I was given. He said, "This is an oboe," and I had no idea what an oboe was. So I took this thing home and opened it, and it was, sort of old battered school instrument with a couple of split reeds in it. And so of course I still had no idea. Anyway, and then there wasn't I was brought up in the country, and there wasn't an oboe teacher, so I think I was taught by a bassoon teacher for quite a while.
Oh, it's close enough.
Yeah, yeah, really. But it was actually participating in the local youth orchestra that I suddenly got it. I think we were away on a summer or Easter course, and we did chamber music like you do in this thing. And I remember playing it was a Mozart C minor divertimento, I think, and that was it was such almost like a shattering experience of realizing how powerful it could be. That at that point I decided, age 13 or 14, that was what I wanted to do. So there's the usual fuss because I was all lined up to do maths and science and physics and all that.
So,
Anyway, the school gave in and said, okay. And then for quite a while, I thought, I knew I wasn't going to be probably a performer, but I did enjoy composing. I've always enjoyed composing. So um, I, I sort of went through the usual hoops that you went through and got a scholarship to learn the oboe properly on the mainland. And then I went to the Royal Academy of Music in London and studied for a degree, which was unusual in those days. Musicians didn't study for degrees usually.
yes, actually, yes.
And they just did performance courses. And you were kind of, it was a wild west really. You were just left on your own really. There wasn't much support, to put it mildly. In
Mine,
those
mine was a
days.
bit like that too. We were a bit
Yeah,
colonial
yeah,
in those days, yes.
yeah. And yeah, it was, you just had to kind of, it was all about, the clear thing as it is now, it's all about networks and forming relationships with other musicians, because otherwise how are you ever going to get work? Unless you're in someone's black book, just to phone up when they need someone.
Yes.
But that's not always obvious when you come in from the outside, how it works. Anyway, um, and I ended up studying oboe, piano, harpsichord and composition, so those are my things, yeah. But I
Harpsichord.
love
Awesome.
yeah, I love the music of the Baroque, and I liked, because I still was quite had a sort of mathematical science bent, so I quite like figured eight and all that stuff, and improvising and all that, and composing. Anyway, the next transformative experience really was I volunteered at a local school for the blind, second year, third year. Well, I didn't really volunteer. I was press ganged by my landlady's son. He said, "You must come and see these kids." They were amazing. He said they're just amazing natural musicians. And so, at the time you're kind of aware of the dangers of volunteering because you never escape, do you, once you volunteer?
No,
I
no.
used to put it off for a while. Anyway, I couldn't, in the end I ran out of excuses. So I went and did some work with the kids in the evenings. It's a boarding school. In fact, my house is opposite the school, so I can see it here. And I'm still volunteering at the school, which is rather nice. That's 40 years later.
That's lovely.
Um, we're about to do the summer scheme they do. The kids are much more complex now than they were in those days.
Do you think
But
that's because the diagnoses they're getting better at diagnosing comorbid conditions?
to an
Yeah.
extent, there's the social element like that.
Mm.
There's also massive medical changes. So
Yes,
a lot of the causes of so-called simple disabilities have gone away through inoculation and stuff,
that's
um,
true.
and through very simple medical interventions.
Mm.
But children with more complex needs are surviving. So children born at 23 weeks are surviving, but often with a complex cocktail of conditions. Children who are very, very poorly are kept going. Really,
Mm.
initially, Linden Lodge, which is the school, opened a specialist unit for children with profound and complex needs, in the expectation it would just be a primary unit because the children weren't expected to live, and then they all did, and then it became a secondary unit, and now they're worried about where
What
to
happens
set.
next?
They do, a lot of them do
Yes.
pass away, but these children really on the kind of borderline, really, of what we call existing, I suppose, with very, very high
Yeah.
levels of care.
Yeah, the quality of life
But
is quite questionable, isn't it? Mm.
it is wistful, yeah. But music seems to be the one thing really that almost unfailingly seems to engage right across the spectrum of need and ability. And so, yeah, I was very fascinated by how these young blind children, many of whom were actually autistic, but we didn't use the word autistic 40 years ago. We just thought they were a bit quirky, which they are, for sure.
Yes.
Um, obsession on all the things that we now recognise as being part of autism. But I like the quirkiness, because the quirkiness might mean a child with learning difficulties actually loved Bach Fugues, loved the architecture of inverted subjects and augmentation, and I totally got that way of thinking. And so actually, to my surprise, I discovered there wasn't anyone actually working in that field. I mean, there were people teaching very able blind children and very blind musicians, as there always have been, using
Yes.
braille music and stuff. In fact, one of the best known alumni of Lyndon Lodge's George Shearing, the great jazz pianist, um, he went there in the early 20th century. Yeah, so the school's been around a long time. But I suppose I forged a new path working with these kids who were, some of whom were scarcely verbal or non-verbal, a lot of whom had quite challenging behaviour, um, and previously were considered ineducable. I mean, people didn't educate people that weren't within boundaries in those days.
Mm.
They used to call it ESNM, which was educationally subnormal moderate, and ESNS, which was educationally subnormal severe. But children with profound needs were all in hospital, insofar as they lived at all.
Mm.
A lot of children with what we now call severe learning difficulties and autism just didn't go to school. They just stayed at home or were cared for in social care.
So do you think the music allows them to express, it's a way for them to express what they're feeling and communicate when they're struggling to use other forms of communication?
Yeah, definitely. So over the years, I evolved a theory that music is like a proxy language for a lot of
Yes.
these children.
Yes.
I think now, we know through research that music develops in the brain before speech. It seems obvious.
Really?
It's it's a developmental stage. So if you pick up a baby, you don't start talking about the weather or something. Well, you may do, but I mean, you're more likely to go boop, 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 boop. I mean, you make musical sounds, and the baby makes these affective, emotional expressions in sound. They go whoop, don't they? And all the psychological research now shows that these are the underpinnings of melody, and they evolve into
Wow.
melody. So really, in a literal sense, music is the foundation of speech. And a lot of the kids that don't get to the speech stage, it's just too difficult. And a lot of autistic children, it's very difficult as
Yes.
well. Not the more Aspergery ones, but the
Yes.
classical.
And the
Um,
atypicals, I imagine too. I think the atypical ones would be the more challenging because, I mean, they're all different anyway, but they're
yeah,
particularly different, you know? Mm.
yeah.
Does that
But
have any implications on reading in that case and literacy? Because,
yeah.
like there's been so much literature on or well actually that's not true. I was going to say there's been so much emphasis, I guess, in a traditional sense of read and play. And as a
Okay.
musician, for thousands of years, reading was just not part of the vibe, or your experience. It was passed down, master to apprentice type of thing. And you really have to stop and think, particularly when you're teaching blind children, whether you are going to insist on doing the whole braille thing. I personally don't see the point because the their memory and oral, it's an oral tradition, an oral rather than an oral one of what we're doing. But if it's something they want to do, sure, but not as an underpinning, as in read and then play. I've always felt it should be the other way around, that you play and you listen and you express and you write down so you don't forget. But of course, traditional tuition now is all about read and play, and I think they've got it backwards. So if the studies are showing um, that music expression is coming prior to even speech, therefore,
Yeah,
wouldn't that
yeah,
have implications for literacy?
of course. Yeah. No, I mean, I was trained as a classical musician and
Yes.
trained in a traditional way. And the sad thing is that I mean, a lot of music teaching is pretty second rate, to be honest.
Oh,
It's people
absolutely.
who just, do what was done to them, following the, very, very narrow syllabuses of the
Yes.
exam board.
Yes.
And the kids, they often come to me not aged, but, grade 8 and plus, and they can't actually hear what they're playing when it comes down to
No,
it.
I know. Isn't
They
it
go,
awful?
can you play me the underlying harmonies of that melody? How's it constructed? No idea.
The one that's
Um,
really surprising is when you say to them, "Did you know that Bach, who was the pop star of his time, was a really cool improviser?" They go, "What?
yeah, yeah,
Improvising? Really? Baroque?" And I go, "Uh
yeah,
huh." And
yeah.
I've had teachers argue with me until they're blue in the face. What are you talking about? Bach was a traditional Western musician. Well, hello, where do you think it all came from? Oh, and it's just fascinating the level of
He used to have improvisation competitions with Telemann and others, didn't he?
yes. What's
I
a
mean,
cadenza, people? Hello,
that's
really?
the way they trained musicians was the ability to improvise.
Yes.
No, I totally agree with you. The experience at Linden Lodge with blind children upended all my views of, as it seems to have done with you, of what's important. And so, luckily, because I was a church organist as a teenager, to earn money, like you do all sorts of things. Play for ballet classes, play for even I'm an atheist, but I still play for the church to make money.
Oh, it's great music.
Um,
Yes.
yeah, yeah. But also, I discovered that to play in a traditional church service, to do 3 services a week, is a huge amount of repertoire to learn. So I pretty quickly learned to improvise because it's much easier.
Yes.
And you could just fill in, you can fill in the odd 30 seconds you have to fill in, and
Yeah, you just
if
follow
they
the
have
lead sheet. That's right.
so I learned to improvise, and then going to work with the kids at Linda Lodge, they all played by ear. They could all play anything in any key, and pick up an
Yes.
instrument and play. And so I quickly realised that the rather recherche abilities I was developing at music college weren't much use really,
No.
because I couldn't play the latest television theme tune that they wanted, in C sharp, because the piano was a 17 flat, so you had to play it in C sharp. Um, I learned fast. Yeah, I copied them really. And nowadays, I would say, and it's really realizing that notation is an important part of some musicians' lives. If you're going to be a classical session musician, you have
Oh,
to be able to read it.
absolutely. It has its place.
And
There's no
play,
question. Yes.
but for kids who just want to play whatever they want to play, the latest. Well, these days it tends to be the latest game. The game themes that they use on their computer
Yes.
games and things,
Yes.
as well as jingles and anything they hear on YouTube, of course. And it could be Verdi Requiem. It could be one of those. I can't remember the names of the games because I don't play them. But Super Mario 3 or something, or it could be the latest Frozen theme, or whatever it
That's
is.
right. That's right.
So I always, with any child, and I only teach kids with special needs or special abilities, so I have great fun with prodigies as well. But I always start with the sound, with improvising, with playing by ear. And then it's actually like you, if some of them want to do notation, and it's obviously going to be important because they want to play in classical chamber groups and things.
Yes.
So just like ordinary literacy,
Yes.
reading comes from as a natural part of the musical interaction,
Mm.
not as a sort of academic exercise. And having said that, I would say 80% of the kids play by ear and 20% use notation because that's what they want to do. Some of them are, some of the bright autistic kids are amazing at notation. They can just sit and read a score and play. And I think that's fantastic. And I teach a little Russian boy called Fedor, who is totally non-verbal. Well, in fact, he says one word, it was "niet." "Niet."
No.
No. His first thing, cough, basically. Adam, stop. "Niet." So he was, oh gosh, it's been recorded as well.
It's okay.
Yeah. But anyway, but he was an extraordinary boy. He was born with quite a lot of his brain outside his skull, and he shouldn't have survived, and he did. And I saw him, they drove across Europe to see me in Holland one time because they couldn't fly because he had shunts in his head and stuff.
Oh, wow.
And he was, look at tiny age 4, he was just playing all these chords and things very beautifully. And clearly had a fantastic ear. Anyway, I see him about every 3 months and work with him. And I noticed he's about 8 or 9 now. Excuse me, I'm just going to get this.
What advice would you give to someone starting out now compared to, if they want to go down not so much
Yeah.
exactly the same path as you, but certainly something similar? What advice would you give them?
Well, I think the world's a much more open place than it was 40 years ago. For a start, when I went back to music college and tried to interest my teachers in the kids, and they just thought I was kind of totally bonkers. I mean, there were 2 routes. Either you were a performing musician in the music business, or you went to work in a public school, which is our private school system, as a tutor. Those were the 2 routes. And why anyone would want to waste their time with these weird kids, they couldn't figure out. So I think what's changed is that now it's part of all sort of conservatoire training, the idea of the social responsibility that goes with performing art. And all the funding is now, certainly in England, I'm sure it's similar in Moscow,
Yes, it is.
is linked to social responsibility as well. So you can't just get your £100,000 put on some performance of some Baroque opera. You have to bring society to you, and actively
Yes.
to engage. So the whole idea of engagement and participation is much better. So I think students probably come with a slightly more open mind. So a lot of them have had some experience of working in a special school or in an old people's home or something. Also, I think because just generally social inclusion is better than it was.
Yes, that's
generally.
true.
So you see a lot more disabled people around, and so people are more used to the idea that people are, the whole neurodiversity thing, the whole
Yes.
celebrating different. It's always linked with Black Lives Matter. The whole business that actually everyone's different, and we should actually celebrate that difference rather than pigeonhole people. So that whole diversity and inclusion thing, I think, has really helped and goes on helping. It's got a long way to go, but it's better than it
Well, the whole
was.
language has changed now, isn't it? From special and retarded and all that sort of thing that
Yeah,
used to be used, willy-nilly, to now additional needs, and this sort of
yeah,
thing, which I think is a good step forward. But yeah, it's
yeah.
interesting
Interestingly,
perspective.
yeah. So I sort of see it as a journey that we're on, and
Mm.
the way I work a lot with aspiring teachers and students, and it's just going back to that model of I reluctant to say master apprentice, but essentially, the way musicians have always learned is by coming alongside someone who's a bit better than they are. That's the
Right.
way in the youth orchestra, you sit next to someone who's better than you are, and you try to copy them, don't you?
Yes.
And so it is with teaching. So I work with about 15 or 20 mostly severely autistic kids every week, and students come along. Sometimes they stay for a year and become familiar with that way of working. Some just sort of look with wide eyes and think, bloody hell, I'll go back to my field. Thank you very much. But almost all of them love it. And lots of professional musicians come who are fairly jaded, age 45. And they come working with the kids it's like a breath of fresh air because they have no preconceptions as to
Yeah,
what is good and what's bad. You know, they respect you if you can follow what they're doing, not because you can play a Wagner, you know, orchestra piece or something.
that's right.
And it's very rich. Also, we run a course at University of Roehampton called Sounds of Intent, which is for people who want to do this kind of thing. It's a postgraduate 1 year course. So we've had about 70 people through, I would say, in the last 6 or 7 years.
So
We're
is
actually
that,
taking,
sorry, is that
yeah,
as an instrumental teacher or as a therapist? Like more
no,
music
that,
therapy or a bit of both?
no, it's everything. It's about using music to promote wider development and enjoyment in children who have special needs or special abilities right across the piece. So it could be
Wow.
baby, it could be stuff. And that's very good. It's very reflective practice. So some
Yeah.
people come as professional musicians,
Yes.
some come with who are experienced teaching age, you know, classroom assistants who can play a bit but have never had any formal musical training. And interestingly, they're the ones that tend to be better at it.
Yes, I was going to ask you that question. I'm
Yeah,
finding that as well. Um,
yeah.
I get a lot of questions from teachers who are very established and very well respected, and look, I've got a problem because I've just I've just had this autistic child, this parent come and enroll, and I don't know what to do. Um, do what you normally
Mm.
do, connect with them. Just connect with them and just relax. And it's actually quite refreshing because you don't have to follow that whole examination pathway, which seems to be such a big deal these days.
No,
Yeah,
no, no. They often come. The musicians come to play with the kids with their music stand and their music. So throw that away.
absolutely. Yes,
You think,
yes.
listen,
Well,
and once they
Adam,
got over that fear, you know, it can be very, very enjoyable. Yeah.
absolutely. Look, I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed talking with you.
Great,
I
lovely to
really
connect.
appreciate your time. Thank you so much.